We're going to move now to a critically important set of issues that are kind of all overlapping, but sort of emanating out from recent events that took place in China. Of course, you had the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. You had the anniversary of the 80th, I think I'm getting that right, 80th anniversary of the end of the war against fascism there in China as well. And, even how we think about World War II, and I think an interesting reality for those of us in the West. And of course, preceding both of those events, the meeting between the heads of state of India and China, which had its own momentousness to it. So there's a lot there to cover. There's a lot going on and a lot rippling out from it. And we are very, very honored to be joined as we continue the show to help us understand all this by Vijay Prashad, who is the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute. Vijay, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, I want to say something that's the opposite of what Rania said, which is that it's not that I'm surprised that you're not on Instagram. I'm actually sort of trembling thinking what you're going to do on Instagram. That scares me. It's because you...
No, why are you scared? I have to know now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Instagram is where people do all kinds of strange and quirky things. And I think of Eugene more of the person with a social media account where he can read out, a chapter of a book or something erudite and scholarly, not, show himself dancing to the latest trend in his underwear.
A lot of moonlight pictures will be coming. It's going to be, could be exciting.
To get a video like that, we're going to have to get a lot more than 52 patrons.
That's true. I do love to dance, but hey, look, you gotta draw a line somewhere.
You gotta pay. You gotta pay for it.
I don't know if anyone the heads of state at the SCO meeting likes to dance, but I would actually like to know that. That being said, a lot happening. Vijay, one of the big themes that you all have been bringing out in Tricontinental recently is the new mood in the global South, and I think this in a sort of hackneyed way has been kind of the mainstream discussion, although not seen correctly. But looking at all these events, the way they all came together, which I thought was interesting, the sort of end of the world, the victory over fascism in China, the SCO meeting, which is obviously very contemporary, the relations between China and India, which have its own, 1,000+ years historicity to it. It seemed to speak to this new mood in the global South and where we are. And I was hoping to just start with your thoughts about that.
Well, in a way, it all begins again with Donald Trump. You'll be happy to know, because after he was not able to really close the deal on Ukraine, after that sort of spilled out of control, he decided to punish India with an additional 25% tariff, raising the tariff barrier to 50% of Indian goods and services entering the United States, a gazetted set of goods and services. Well, what he said was, if India stops buying crude oil from Russia, then that 25% additional tariff will go. Of course, this is not a political decision by India to buy oil from Russia. It buys oil for two reasons. One is to satisfy the domestic market. India is a country with hundreds of millions of very poor people, and even a marginal increase in petroleum prices has a outsized inflation for poor people in terms of food price inflation and fuel price inflation. So India can't afford to give up on discounted Russian oil. Secondly, people may not know this, but Indian refineries are calibrated to Russian crude oil. India buys a large amount of Russian oil, refines it, and then sells it to Europe for a profit. So India doesn't want to forego this enormous advantage it has. Trump wants to cut this off to make Europe entirely dependent on US energy markets, but that's not going to happen for the immediate period. So because of this 50% tariff and the need to somehow, make some gap with the United States, Narendra Modi of India suddenly out of nowhere announced that for the first time in 7 years, he's going to go to China to meet Xi Jinping and Putin and others at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin. This was enormously surprising. He hadn't planned it. In fact, I very jokingly in a television program in China said Modi should go to China and should, shake hands with Mr. Xi and that'll show Trump for the tariff. And next thing you heard, Maybe Modi is listening to me and taking my advice. Who knows? Well, he showed up in China. And what was interesting, if we take social media as a pretty good indicator of what they want to present, Mr. Modi presented photographs of himself with Xi and Putin all being chummy together. And then a very important set of photographs of Mr. Modi with Mr. Putin traveling together for their bilateral meeting, saying, no, we are not going to have distance from Russia. Well, this is interesting. At the SCO, 50% of the world's population is represented. It's a very important, it's called a regional gathering, but most of the world's population happens to live in this region. So it's 50% of the world's population, only 25% of the world's GDP as far as the Financial Times is concerned. But I'd like to contest that a little bit. Anyway, doesn't matter. We're not debating that. What we're talking about is that this is a very significant event because it shows you that the Indian elite, so the Indian moneyed population, is unable to actually break from its own material interests. That, they may instinctively want to be standing beside the Americans and cozying up to Trump and so on, but there's no economic benefit right now. The economic benefit is in buying discounted gasoline from Russia and perhaps starting to increase trade with China. So it's actually economics running the show here, Eugene. It's not politics. This is not a political change by Mr. Modi going from the extreme right-wing pro-US political orientation to suddenly becoming, a pan-Eurasianist. This is not what's happening. This is economics driving the vehicle, not politics.
It really is interesting to see U.S. policy backfire here and just to see the images. I mean, I watched, as I often do, a lot of mainstream media coverage of this meeting, of this gathering, and a lot of it was just in shock at watching India's leader embrace China's leader when India is supposed to be this like anti-China, American-backed, bulwark in that, growing Cold War. And I even saw this one episode of Christiane Amanpour's show on CNN where a stand-in host was saying, if Henry Kissinger were alive today, like he would just be like, face palming over this, because it's like, this is not how you deal with rivals, by bringing them together with like some of your own allies. So it's just an interesting dynamic at play. I mean, feel free to comment on that if you'd like, because you're nodding along and smiling, Vijay. But I also wanted to ask, obviously this isn't what's bringing these groups of countries together, but it was interesting to also see them condemning what Israel's doing in Gaza, which has, happened often from global South countries. But all that's to say, yes, it's the economics bringing them together. And maybe this is me grasping at straws. But as like U.S. economic policy has this backlash that brings a country like India into the arms of China, do you think this could have an impact, on the ongoing just hyper imperialist brutality we're witnessing across the entire global South, with Gaza being the worst?
Well, to take the first point you made, which I think is a very important point, which is the surprise that people seem to have for India sort of taking one step, maybe half a step away from the United States on the attempt to garrote China, really. Well, look, this is not a new thing. This didn't require the Trump tariffs. The Indian government has, over the last year and a half, been demonstrating through different quite, sort of relatively silent ways, demonstrating its desire not to be caught up in the new Cold War between the United States and China. For instance, India sort of backpedaled the Quad, which was the group that included Japan and Australia, the United States and India. India backpedaled out of that. And as a consequence, the United States created a new group called the Squad, which was Japan, Australia, United States, and Philippines, because India really is not keen on getting caught up in this. When the United States, one of the United States senators said that India should join NATO plus, when the Indian foreign minister was asked about this now almost 2 years ago, his answer was, we don't believe in the NATO mentality. These are small, almost silent indications of India not being keen to being drawn into some kind of big, total, final war between the United States and China. They just don't. India doesn't want to be involved in this. I think the message has come loud and clear that the United States is A, not a reliable ally, and B, dangerous, because they don't prioritize development. They prioritize war. And this is not something that the Indian government is either prepared for or ready for. The third aspect was that India went into an air war with Pakistan recently. It was actually a one-night air war, even though the war sort of lasted for 3 days. On that one night, it became pretty clear to Indian military officials and planners that the Pakistanis, using almost 100% Chinese technology, using 100% of Chinese air defense systems, and India using French jets, US, Israeli, and Indian-made air defense systems, India could not prevail. In fact, in some respects, the Chinese system seemed to operate better than the Western system. Well, this was a wake-up call, I think, for India, that, look, the Chinese have developed indigenously jet fighters and their own systems. They cannot be an adversary that India could walk over and so on. So I think these realizations, the military realization, the realization that the United States won't prioritize development, and the idea that the US is offering very little for India's advancement in the world, not even championing for India a permanent seat at the Security Council and so on, that what is gained by being a subordinate ally of the United States, even the Indian elites are coming to that view that not much is gained. And so I think this kind of softening to China, the increase of visas over the course of the last few months for travelers on both directions, conversations about track 2, track 3 diplomacy taking place, and so on. This is a realization of reality. It's India coming to reality. That being the poodle of the United States doesn't get you anything. Ask the English that. They decided to poodle the US into Iraq. They poodled the US here, there, and everywhere. What did they get out of it? They didn't even get a good trade deal with the United States.
Yeah, I mean, that's got very little, that's for sure, negative returns. Well, one other aspect of this, Vijay, that I think is important, and one thing that people probably don't know we shared, we both have family members who fought in what was called the India-China-Burma Theater at the time. But of course, China having this massive parade on the 80th anniversary of the victory over fascism there, Japanese aggression and anti-fascist war, I believe, is how they referred to it. Really a momentous occasion in many ways. I think it's obviously World War II is so coded to, Europe and really in Asia, really kind of just to the atomic bomb to some degree. And I think the huge amount of death in China, the impact of the Chinese forces in the broader war is so unknown. So this also felt like in and of itself, China sort of asserting its role in history as part of asserting, its role in in contemporary society.
It's very interesting. If we can again start with Trump. Trump's tweet in response to the military parade on the 3rd of September was to see the parade as an act of aggression. But I actually watched most of the parade and read it in the opposite direction. I don't think this was a war of aggression. I think what was being said on the 80th anniversary of the defeat of fascism is the following: that the Soviet citizens and Chinese patriots and communists together sacrificed about 50 million lives. Tricontinental has done a big study of this, and we're going to release this in a few weeks. We've done a very, very detailed study of the war dead. And in fact, World War II starts in China in 1937 at the Marco Polo Bridge incident. And in fact, if you're really serious about this, it doesn't end in 1945 in Asia. It goes all the way till the armistice in Korea. In other words, World War II goes from 1937 to 1953-54. It's a very long war, much longer than in Europe from 1939 to 1945, much longer than the US participation in the war, which was only from 1941 to 1945. This is 1937 to either 1945 or to 1949 or to 1954. It's a very long war. And 50 million Soviet citizens and Chinese patriots. And then if you add the Koreans, the Vietnamese and others, the numbers are astronomical. United States didn't even lose, I think less than 1 million people died in that war. And yet Hollywood, for instance, doesn't have the decency to provide a movie where the people fighting the Nazis don't come from Iowa or from Ohio or somewhere. They look like Tom Hanks, not like your and my relatives. In fact, what we also found, Eugene, which is really significant, is that 80% of the Wehrmacht was destroyed by the Red Army. The Red Army actually breaks the back of the Nazi forces, of the German forces, really, because the Chinese are fighting the Japanese on the other sector. But the Soviet Red Army takes out the Wehrmacht. And I think that is underappreciated. Even though now people grudgingly say things like, well, the Soviets liberated this concentration camp and Auschwitz and this and that, that's grudgingly talked about. But what's not understood is how much of Nazi hardware was destroyed on Soviet territory. And when the Soviet Red Army advances across Poland into Germany, making it easier for the rest of the Allied forces, including, my relatives who were also in Italy, who came up Italy. The Italians basically capitulated, and that's the other point I want to make to you when you mentioned our relatives in the Burma theater. There's a great film by Osman Sembene called Camp at Thiore, which is about French armies that came from Africa, from West Africa. And these are African troops who fought in France during World War II. It's based on a true story. They returned to West Africa after the war. The French put them into a concentration camp. These West African troops demand liberation and they demand pay. The French don't give it to them. And there's a character in the film with a Nazi helmet running around speaking the truth. And then the French just kill them. It's actually based on a true story. It's a remarkable film by Sembene Osman. That's what happened to us in World War II. We fought to liberate Europe, and then they wanted to come back and colonize us. Talk to the Kenyans. Talk to the Malay people. Talk to the Indonesians when the Dutch came back to try to reestablish colonialism. Talk to the Vietnamese who helped fight against Japanese militarism. And then the French wanted to come back. And then the Americans wanted to come back. I mean, this is our history of World War II. And that's what was being celebrated. Not to say we can defeat you, but to say we don't want fascism. It seems what Xi Jinping was saying to the West is we don't want fascism. We defeated fascism, but you are playing footsie with fascism now. You are playing footsie with militarism and war now. We know what a sacrifice is. We are saying from beginning to end, 1945, when it ended to now, we don't want war again. And I think that is a really powerful anti-war message. The parade begins with him saluting war veterans. They're like 100 years old, okay? That was extremely moving to me because what they are saying is, why did we have to lose your comrades? Why did people have to die? We don't want to repeat that.
Mm-hmm. No, remarkable thing. My grandfather was there working on the Lato Road and came back to Virginia where everything was Jim Crow segregation. So says a lot about all of these things and many different pieces. Tricontinental is doing research on just about everything under the sun. So I hope everyone is checking out all the great work you all are doing. Dr. Vijay Prashad, as always, thanks so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks, Eugene. Thanks, Rania.